Tucked between the towering peaks of the Caucasus and the warm waters of the Black Sea sits a country that barely exists on paper. Welcome to Abkhazia, a place so diplomatically invisible that most world maps simply absorb it into its neighbor, Georgia, as though it were never there at all. But step past the politics for a moment, and you'll find a nation with its own flag, its own president, its own anthem, and a population utterly convinced of its own reality. Only a small cluster of countries, Russia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Syria, and a couple of remote Pacific nations, officially recognize Abkhazia as sovereign. Everyone else, including the United Nations, still considers it a breakaway region of Georgia, frozen in an unresolved territorial dispute since the early 1990s. This strange half-existence isn't just a footnote, it shapes everyday life here in ways most countries never have to think about. Abkhaz citizens often hold passports that are essentially worthless outside a tiny circle of allied states, meaning international travel, banking, and even simple things like receiving mail from abroad become logistical puzzles. Diplomats rarely visit. Airlines don't fly here. And yet, life continues, markets open, children go to school, weddings happen along the coastline, all inside a country that, according to most of the world, isn't technically a country at all. The Abkhaz people call their homeland the land of the soul, a name that hints at an identity far older and deeper than any modern border dispute. Long before Georgia, Russia, or the Soviet Union carved up this stretch of coastline, the Abkhaz existed as a distinct ethnic group with their own language, one that linguists still find fascinating for its complexity, boasting dozens of consonant sounds unlike almost anything else in the region. That linguistic uniqueness is a clue to just how separate Abkhaz culture has always felt from its neighbors, recognition or not. So whether or not you'll find Abkhazia on your phone's map app, it exists in the fullest sense for the people who live, love, and build their lives within its unrecognized borders, a nation defined not by international paperwork, but by the stubborn persistence of its own people. Long before anyone argued over Abkhazia's political status, this coastline was the single most desirable vacation spot in the entire Soviet Union. Picture endless rows of sunbathers stretched along Black Sea beaches, palm trees swaying against a backdrop of snow-capped mountains, and grand, columned sanatoriums built specifically so factory workers from Moscow and steel workers from Siberia could recover their strength in the warm subtropical air. This was Abkhazia's golden age, running roughly from the 1930s through the 1980s, when the region proudly wore the nickname, the Soviet Riviera. Joseph Stalin himself fell in love with the area, commissioning a personal dacha near Lake Ritsa, hidden deep in the mountains and reportedly built with secret escape tunnels in case he ever needed to vanish without warning. Beyond Stalin's paranoid getaway, entire towns along the coast, particularly the capital Sukhumi, transformed into resort cities practically overnight. Elegant seafront promenades were lined with cafes, botanical gardens imported exotic plants from around the world, and sanatoriums specialized in treating everything from tuberculosis to simple exhaustion, all wrapped in a climate mild enough to support citrus groves and tea plantations. Soviet propaganda loved showcasing Abkhazia as proof that communism could deliver paradise, and for millions of ordinary citizens who could never dream of visiting the actual French Riviera, this was as close to glamour as life would ever get. The trains arriving from Moscow were often packed to capacity during summer months, and getting a coveted holiday voucher to an Abkhazian sanatorium was considered a genuine reward for hard work and loyalty to the state. Even now, decades later, remnants of that era linger. Crumbling Soviet-era hotels with faded murals still dot the coastline, their grand staircases and abandoned ballrooms serving as eerie, beautiful reminders of what once was. Some have been lovingly restored and reopened to a trickle of Russian tourists who still make the journey today. Others sit exactly as they were left, frozen mid-decay, swallowed by vines and salt air. Walking through Sukhumi today, you can still trace the outline of that vanished glamour beneath the weathered facades, a ghostly echo of the era when this small stretch of coastline represented the pinnacle of Soviet leisure and luxury. Every story about Abkhazia's beauty eventually collides with the story of its devastation, and that collision happened suddenly and violently between 1992 and 1993. As the Soviet Union dissolved and Georgia declared independence, tensions between Georgians and ethnic Abkhaz, simmering for generations, erupted into open warfare. The conflict was brutal and remarkably fast-moving, tearing through a region that had spent decades as a peaceful holiday destination. Sukhumi itself became a battlefield, its once elegant seafront hotels reduced to burned-out shells, bullet hole scarring buildings that had hosted honeymooning Soviet couples just years earlier. By the time the fighting ended with an Abkhaz and Russian-backed victory, the human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest around 10,000 people died, and this doesn't include the far larger number affected by displacement. Somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 ethnic Georgians, who made up a significant portion of the pre-war population, fled or were forcibly expelled from Abkhazia, many never able to return to homes they'd lived in for generations. This demographic shift fundamentally altered the region, transforming what had been a genuinely multi-ethnic society, home to Georgians, Abkhaz, Russians, Armenians, and Greeks all living side by side, into a much more homogeneously Abkhaz territory. The physical scars from that war are still remarkably visible today, decades later. Abandoned apartment blocks in Sukhumi stand with missing walls and shattered windows, weeds growing through what used to be living rooms. The old Soviet parliament building sits as a hollow, roofless ruin right in the city center, deliberately left unrepaired as a kind of unofficial war memorial. Former grand hotels along the coast, the same ones that once epitomized Soviet luxury, now stand as haunting skeletons, their swimming pools cracked and empty, their ballrooms open to the sky. Yet amid this visible devastation, reconstruction has slowly crept forward in patches. Some buildings have been rebuilt, new cafes have opened along stretches of restored promenade, and daily life has cautiously resumed its rhythm. Still, the war remains the defining rupture in modern Abkhaz history, the singular event that separates the region's glamorous past from its uncertain, still unresolved present, and its physical and emotional aftermath continues to shape how Abkhazia exists today. If you ever want to humble a linguist, hand them a sample of spoken Abkhaz and watch their confidence slowly evaporate. Tucked away in this small, disputed corner of the Caucasus is one of the most phonetically extreme languages still spoken by human beings today. While English gets by with around 24 consonant sounds, Abkhaz operates with somewhere between 58 and 67, depending on the dialect and how linguists choose to count them. To put that in perspective, that's nearly 3 times the consonant inventory of English, packed into a language spoken by roughly 100,000 people worldwide. Vowels, on the other hand, are almost an afterthought. Some analyses suggest Abkhaz gets by with as few as 2 or 3 distinct vowel sounds, meaning nearly all of the language's expressive power comes from an extraordinarily dense thicket of consonants clustering together in ways that feel almost impossible for outsiders to pronounce. Linguists studying Caucasian languages often point to Abkhaz, alongside its close relatives like Abkhazia and Uzbek, as some of the most consonant-heavy languages ever documented on the planet. This isn't just a curiosity for academic papers, it's a defining feature of Abkhaz identity, one that locals take genuine pride in. The language belongs to the Northwest Caucasian family, a small and increasingly endangered linguistic group that has survived centuries of empires, wars, and shifting borders without being absorbed into the more dominant languages surrounding it, like Georgian or Russian. Abkhaz has its own alphabet too, based on Cyrillic script but modified with extra characters and diacritical marks to capture sounds that Russian simply doesn't have symbols for. Walking through Sukhumi, you'll see this alphabet on street signs, government buildings, and local newspapers, standing as a quiet but persistent declaration of cultural distinctiveness in a region where identity itself is constantly contested. Schools in Abkhazia teach the language alongside Russian, ensuring it continues passing to new generations rather than fading into academic footnotes. In many ways, this impossibly complex language has become one of the clearest symbols of what makes Abkhazia genuinely unique, a linguistic fingerprint found nowhere else on Earth, surviving against considerable odds in a place the rest of the world still struggles to properly define. Step away from Sukhumi's crumbling war-torn buildings and head inland, and Abkhazia reveals a completely different side of itself, one built around fertile soil, subtropical warmth, and a way of life that has barely changed for generations. This is a land shaped by agriculture in ways that feel almost old-fashioned compared to the fast-paced modern world, and that's precisely what gives it such distinct character. The mild, humid climate along the coast makes Abkhazia one of the very few places in the entire former Soviet Union where citrus fruits actually thrive. Orange and tangerine groves stretch across hillsides, their fruit ripening in a climate more reminiscent of the Mediterranean than anywhere else in this part of the world. Alongside the citrus, tea plantations blanket entire hillsides, a legacy of Soviet-era agricultural planning that once positioned Abkhazia as a key tea-producing region for the entire USSR. Even today, despite decades of economic isolation following the war, many of these tea gardens continue operating, tended by families who've passed down the knowledge of when to pick, how to dry, and how to process the leaves through multiple generations. Wine holds an equally important place in Abkhaz culture, and locals will proudly tell you their winemaking traditions stretch back thousands of years, some of the oldest in the entire world. Grapes grown in small family vineyards produce distinctive local wines rarely exported beyond the region, meaning tasting them essentially requires actually visiting Abkhazia, something the vast majority of the global population will simply never do given the political complications involved. Beyond fruit and wine, hazelnuts represent another surprisingly significant export, with Abkhazia historically supplying a notable portion of hazelnuts used in European chocolate production. An unexpected connection between this obscure disputed territory and the chocolate bars sitting on supermarket shelves thousands of miles away. Rural life here moves at a markedly different pace than in the capital. Extended families often live together across multiple generations, tending small farms, keeping livestock, and preserving traditions around food and hospitality that remain deeply important to Abkhaz identity. Guests are treated with elaborate warmth, often welcomed with long, ceremonial toasts and abundant homemade food, a hospitality tradition shared broadly across the Caucasus region but held with particular pride here. In many ways, this agricultural, family-centered lifestyle represents the quieter, more enduring side of Abkhazia, one that exists entirely separate from international headlines and political disputes, rooted instead in soil, seasons, and traditions passed carefully from one generation to the next. Cross into Abkhazia today, and the first thing you'll likely notice isn't a customs officer waving a red, white, and green flag, it's a Russian soldier. Since the brief but consequential war of 2008 between Russia and Georgia, Russia has maintained a substantial military presence throughout Abkhazia, and that presence has fundamentally reshaped what independence actually means for the small breakaway region. Military bases dot the territory, Russian border guards patrol the administrative boundary line separating Abkhazia from Georgia proper, and Russian rubles, not any Abkhaz currency, serve as the everyday money changing hands in local markets. This arrangement traces back to August 2008, when a short, sharp war erupted between Russia and Georgia over another breakaway region, South Ossetia. In the aftermath, Russia formally recognized both South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states, a move almost nobody else in the international community followed. For Abkhazia, this recognition brought desperately needed security guarantees and economic lifelines, but it came bundled with deep, unavoidable dependency. Russian investment now funds much of Abkhazia's infrastructure, Russian pensions supplement the incomes of many elderly residents, and Russian tourists represent virtually the entire visitor economy along those once glamorous Soviet-era beaches. This dependency creates an uncomfortable paradox at the heart of Abkhaz identity. The people fought a devastating war specifically for the right to self-determination, to escape being governed by outside powers, yet decades later, they find themselves economically and militarily bound to Moscow in ways that leave genuinely little room for independent maneuvering on the world stage. Critics both inside and outside Abkhazia describe this relationship using an unflattering term, a client state, technically self-governing but practically steered by decisions made in the Kremlin. Local politicians occasionally push back publicly against Russian influence, particularly regarding property rights and land sales to Russian citizens, revealing genuine tension beneath the surface of this partnership. Yet the fundamental calculus remains largely unchanged. Without Russian military protection, many Abkhaz genuinely believe renewed conflict with Georgia would be inevitable, and without Russian economic support, the territory's already fragile economy would likely collapse entirely. So Abkhazia exists today in a peculiar, uncomfortable state, independent enough to fly its own flag and elect its own president, yet dependent enough that the real decisions shaping its future are frequently made hundreds of miles away, inside offices in Moscow rather than Sukhumi. Most capital cities work hard to hide their wounds, patching over damage and presenting a polished face to visitors. Sukhumi does the opposite, and that's precisely what makes it so unforgettable. Walking through Abkhazia's capital feels like stepping into two different time periods simultaneously, layered messily on top of each other. On one street, you'll find a beautifully restored seafront promenade lined with palm trees, cafes serving strong coffee, and couples strolling past flower beds exactly as they might have done during the Soviet era. Turn the corner, though, and you're suddenly staring at the hollowed-out shell of the old parliament building, its windows empty, its roof long gone, left standing deliberately unrepaired since the war of the early 1990s as an unofficial monument to what was lost. This isn't neglect born from laziness or lack of resources, though economic isolation certainly plays a role. It's something closer to a collective choice, a city that refuses to fully erase the evidence of its recent trauma even while rebuilding around it. Sukhumi's botanical garden, established back in the 19th century, still operates today, its exotic plants and towering trees offering a genuinely peaceful escape just blocks away from bullet-scarred apartment buildings. The city's old train station, once a bustling hub connecting Soviet tourists to their beach holidays, now sits largely abandoned, its grand facade crumbling but still recognizably elegant beneath decades of neglect. Street markets buzz with activity nonetheless, vendors selling fresh produce, homemade wine, and local hazelnuts, life continuing its stubborn rhythm regardless of the surrounding ruins. Russian tourists, drawn by cheap prices and genuine curiosity about this obscure corner of the former Soviet Union, wander between the restored and the ruined, often visibly startled by how starkly the two coexist within the same few city blocks. Local residents, meanwhile, navigate this juxtaposition without much second thought, having grown up entirely surrounded by it. For them, the ruins aren't shocking landmarks, they're simply part of the everyday backdrop of home, woven into childhood memories alongside beach trips and family gatherings. Sukhumi ultimately tells the story of Abkhazia itself in miniature, a place actively living in its present while refusing to fully bury its past, creating a uniquely haunting, beautiful, and deeply human urban landscape found nowhere else in the world. Beyond Abkhazia's contested coastline lies a completely different world, one defined by towering peaks, dense forests, and caves so extensive that scientists are still discovering new chambers within them. The Caucasus Mountains form Abkhazia's dramatic backbone, rising sharply from the Black Sea coast into snow-capped summits that create one of the most striking geographic contrasts found anywhere on the planet. Within just a short drive, visitors can move from subtropical beaches to alpine meadows, an environmental diversity packed into a territory smaller than many American counties. Deep within these mountains sits one of the most extraordinary natural wonders on Earth, the Riviera Cave, also known as Varanja Cave, which for years held the record as the deepest known cave system anywhere on the planet, plunging more than 2,000 meters beneath the surface. Speleologists, scientists who study caves, have spent decades mapping its extraordinary depths, discovering entirely new species of blind, cave-adapted creatures along the way, organisms that have evolved in complete darkness for countless generations, never once seeing sunlight. The cave's extreme depth means expeditions exploring its lower chambers can take weeks, with researchers camping underground in complete isolation, navigating flooded passages and narrow rock formations far removed from any contact with the outside world. Lake Ritsa, nestled high in these mountains, offers a strikingly different but equally captivating natural attraction. This glacial lake, famous for its vivid blue-green water that shifts color dramatically depending on the season and sunlight, was such a favorite retreat for Soviet leaders that Stalin himself, as mentioned earlier, built a private dacha along its shores. Today, the lake remains one of Abkhazia's most visited natural sites, drawing tourists who make the winding mountain journey specifically to witness its almost unnaturally vibrant coloring firsthand. These mountains aren't just scenic backdrops, though. They've historically served as natural fortresses too, providing refuge for Abkhaz communities during centuries of invasions, wars, and shifting empires that swept through the surrounding lowlands. Remote mountain villages, some accessible only by narrow, winding roads, have preserved distinct local traditions and dialects precisely because their isolation kept outside influences at bay for generations. In many ways, these dramatic mountains represent Abkhazia's most enduring natural asset, a landscape of genuine wonder and scientific significance that exists entirely independent of the political disputes defining the region's international status, standing as proof that regardless of who recognizes Abkhazia's sovereignty, nature here continues carving out its own extraordinary story. If you want to genuinely understand Abkhaz culture, forget politics for a moment and pull up a chair at a family dinner table instead, because food here carries meaning that goes far beyond simple sustenance. Abkhaz cuisine centers heavily around ingredients that thrive in this particular subtropical climate, with walnuts standing out as an almost sacred staple, appearing in an astonishing variety of dishes. Walnut sauce, made by grinding the nuts into a thick, rich paste and blending them with garlic, spices, and herbs, accompanies everything from chicken to vegetables, creating flavors that feel simultaneously earthy and luxurious. This particular use of walnuts as a foundational sauce ingredient distinguishes Abkhaz cooking sharply from its neighbors, giving the cuisine a genuinely distinctive character within the broader Caucasus region. Corn plays an equally central role, particularly in the form of abista, a thick, polenta-like porridge that serves as the traditional accompaniment to nearly every meal, replacing bread in many households following older culinary traditions. Traditionally, families eat abista using their hands, tearing off warm portions and using them to scoop up other dishes, a practice that transforms even simple meals into genuinely communal, hands-on experiences. Cheese, particularly a firm, salty variety produced locally, gets grilled, fried, or melted directly into abista, creating rich, satisfying combinations that showcase the genuine simplicity underlying much of Abkhaz home cooking. Wine, as mentioned before, isn't merely a beverage here, it's deeply woven into social rituals, particularly through elaborate, structured toasting traditions shared broadly across Caucasus cultures. A proper Abkhaz feast, known as a supra in neighboring Georgian tradition and following remarkably similar customs locally, involves a designated toastmaster who guides guests through a carefully ordered sequence of toasts, honoring ancestors, celebrating guests, remembering the departed, and wishing prosperity for the future, each toast accompanied by its own specific etiquette and emotional weight. These meals often stretch on for hours, packed with storytelling, laughter, and genuine warmth extended toward guests, including complete strangers, reflecting a hospitality tradition that locals consider absolutely central to their cultural identity. Turning away a guest without offering food and drink would be considered a genuine social failure here, regardless of how modest a family's own circumstances might be. This deep-rooted hospitality, paired with genuinely distinctive flavors built around walnuts, corn, and wine, creates a culinary identity that feels both deeply rooted in Caucasus tradition and unmistakably, distinctly Abkhaz, offering visitors one of the most authentic and memorable ways to understand this small, complicated nation. After exploring Abkhazia's beaches, mountains, language, cuisine, and complicated politics, one question remains hovering over everything. What actually comes next for this small, contested corner of the Caucasus? The honest answer is that nobody, including the Abkhaz themselves, quite knows yet. Economically, the territory remains heavily dependent on Russia, with rubles circulating as everyday currency and Russian tourism representing the overwhelming majority of visitor income along those once legendary beaches. Yet within this dependency, genuine efforts at diversification are slowly taking shape. Agricultural exports, particularly hazelnuts and citrus, continue finding their way into international markets through Russian intermediaries, while a small but growing number of entrepreneurs are attempting to rebuild hospitality infrastructure, renovating old Soviet-era hotels and opening small guesthouses aimed at travelers curious enough to venture beyond typical tourist routes. Politically, the path forward remains genuinely uncertain. Georgia continues formally claiming Abkhazia as its own territory, a position backed by the vast majority of the international community, meaning any long-term resolution would likely require negotiations that neither side currently seems prepared to seriously pursue. Meanwhile, younger generations of Abkhaz, many born after the war entirely, are growing up with complicated, layered identities, fluent in Russian, proud of their distinct Abkhaz heritage, and increasingly connected to the wider world through the internet despite their homeland's official diplomatic isolation. Social media, ironically, has become one of the few genuine bridges connecting ordinary Abkhaz citizens to global conversations, allowing them to share their culture, their grievances, and their daily lives with audiences who might never have otherwise encountered this obscure territory at all. Environmental concerns are also gradually entering local conversation, particularly regarding coastal development and the long-term preservation of those spectacular mountain ecosystems that make the region so naturally distinctive. Whether Abkhazia eventually gains broader international recognition, remains permanently tied to Russia, or finds some entirely different arrangement with Georgia, one thing seems genuinely certain: the Abkhaz people themselves show little sign of abandoning their distinct identity, their unique language, or their deep attachment to this particular stretch of mountains and coastline they call Abkhazia. Regardless of what flags fly officially or which governments extend diplomatic recognition, the story of Abkhazia continues being written daily by ordinary people simply living their lives, rebuilding their communities, and holding tightly to a sense of home in one of the most contested, complicated, and quietly resilient corners found anywhere on the entire map.